teachers of Reddit, have you ever had a crush on a student? Story 1. College professor here. I get a lot of gorgeous students, but the attraction usually lasts as long as it takes them to open their mouths. What can I say? When you're in your 30s, 18-22-year-olds suddenly seem very shallow and immature to you. But then I had a student who was not only stunningly beautiful but also very mature beyond her years, and she had a lot of similar interests to me. And what's better, because she was new to America, she was also a bit lost and confused, and I told her she could to me whenever she wanted if she needed advice and guidance. She did for a while, but I never did anything but just talk with her. As attracted as I was to her, trying to make a move would have been a very tricky thing because student-teacher relationships are very taboo. The thing is though, as she adjusted to America, she started coming by less often because she didn't really need our talks anymore. After the class was over, I hardly ever ran into her anymore, so the opportunity just never presented itself. I look back on it now as for the best thing. Even if she had been interested in me, and I don't think she was, I'm quite used to my students, even the more mature ones, automatically seeing me as an old geezer. Even though I'm 31 now, and this was a couple years ago, if I'd had a relationship with her and we'd been caught, it could have potentially been the end of my career. But I also found that shortly after the class ended, and I stopped seeing her with any frequency, that she fell out of my thoughts too, and I went back to being interested in women my own age who are preferably not my students. I'm actually glad that it doesn't bother me anymore, because I feel like it would be beyond pathetic for someone like me to be so hopelessly in love with a student. Story 2. Your story sort of reminds me of one of my students. I'm 22 and have a senior, so I'd assume 17 or 18, piano student who I most certainly don't have romantic or sexual feelings for. Honestly, the student-teacher barrier comes pretty naturally to me. But I remember after her first lesson being very intrigued, stricken by the fact that she reminds me so much of myself as a high school senior. Same sort of aspirations and motivation that I had at her age. Same sort of unusual taste in music. Same dry and sarcastic sense of humor. She's even got a lot of the same weaknesses that I did before going to conservatory. I don't like her, but I'm fairly certain that high school me would have been all over her. Story 3. I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of influence you have as a young and successful teacher over high school age kids. I don't know how to say this, but you kind of get a free in as the young teacher because they can't relate to the more veteran teachers. The kids see a somewhat idealized version of you, and if you wanted to, it is quite easy to take advantage of that trust. This is why teacher-student relationships are avoided by teachers, because it's hard to tell what's real and what is a byproduct of that special mentor relationship. If you think your student is the one or something, just keep in touch and hit them up when they're an adult. Story 4. I was a top for a drawing class for a couple of semesters. It was the sort of top position where the professor would hand you the outline for the semester and you'd teach one of his classes. There was this one girl that looked like a sort of Persian goddess, and she was fucking talented, which drew me to her even more. We got to the part of the class where we started doing portraits. I'd take volunteers from the class and we'd all draw them. I would bounce between critiquing students' work and doing the portrait myself, because observing is a great way to learn. The first few went very well. I was on my teaching game, and my portraits were up to my standards. Being a good sport, I'd give it to the model when they were done. Then she came up. The thing about drawing is you have to be able to ignore your brain's preconceived ideas of what you are looking at and dissect the visual information analytically. I found her so beautiful. For the first time in my life, I could not do this. I drew, I erased, I drew, I erased. I wasn't bouncing around as much as I had been, because I was so frustrated that I could not draw the one person in the class I wanted to draw. We finished, and it turned out okay. Not great, just okay. I still gave it to her, but I was honestly ashamed of it. At the end of the last portrait class, one of the models asked how they'd done. This led to a discussion on how they'd all done. Persian goddess asked the inevitable question. I told her she was difficult to draw. She asked why. I immediately regretted my initial response. I think I said something about her features being unusual or something cringe-worthy. I wanted to tell her she was too beautiful, but I couldn't. If you're reading this, Persian goddess, I'm sorry. I should have told you that you were gorgeous. Story 5. This may not exactly count, but some years ago I taught English in Japan. I'm a woman, and I taught an older female student at her house. Sorry Reddit, no going where you think. She was quite nice, and one day she asked me to teach a lesson for her son, who was in high school. I agreed. I just came at the usual time and did the lesson with him instead of her. Well, he was a senior in high school, I was in my late 20s, and I thought he was adorable. I don't really feel guilty. My thoughts didn't even begin to approach the sexual side of a crush. I just thought he was cute and sweet. But he definitely had a bit of a crush on me, and our mutual appreciation was probably noticed by the mom. So here is where it gets hilarious. Next week I come to teach the mom again, and we do the usual introductory conversation at the beginning of the lesson. It was during the rainy season, so I said to her that I missed the sun. She looked very confused for a minute, so I pointed up towards the sky to try and mime what was talking about. We were in the first floor of her house, and I'm pretty sure I was pointing upstairs to her son's room, so she continued to misinterpret my English. It took me a minute to realize why she had this upset look on her face, and I don't think I was able to save her from her thoughts. After that day she cancelled the class ... and I never saw either of them again. As this is not a throwaway, let me restate that I never crossed any lines with her son, even in the privacy of my mind. So I don't really feel bad about the whole thing, but I thought my story might amuse Reddit. Story 6. I used to teach entry-level programming at an art school to undergrads and later at the graduate level. It happened all the fucking time, but I never felt bad about it, cause they were adults and I was the same age. Obviously, I couldn't act on anything as a matter of policy, and I certainly didn't let it affect my grading. But goddamn, it was difficult, especially with the 2 instances where I could tell it was mutual. Or maybe it wasn't and they just wanted better grades, I don't know. They both got CS regardless. Story 7. I taught a large lecture class at university level for a number of years. My department head clearly stated that hanky-panky with students was a fireable offense. There were opportunities, but I did not pursue. One situation, though not directly pertinent, stands out. When lecturing, I pay close attention to student reactions. In larger classes, I tended to settle on certain students for my repeated sampling. If they seemed to understand what I was talking about, things were okay. During one lecture on some fairly complex ideas, I had included, among other students, one beautiful co-ed. Until that day, I knew she was beautiful and appreciated her for that, but nothing more. Each time I spot-checked, she was paying rapt attention, eyes wide, full of excitement at the knowledge I was dispensing. I was falling in love during my lecture. Such beauty, and she was enthralled with a topic that I totally loved. I required students to do a journal at the end of each class. She obviously had no clue as to what I was talking about. I was deeply puzzled. She had been right there, at every point. Later in the semester, I went to a men's basketball game. She was a cheerleader, and one of the prime ones at that. Even while our team was being embarrassed by the visitors, the cheerleaders kept doing their job as if the fans' excitement would make a difference in this lost cause. And she was one of their leaders, eyes wide, showing the same excitement and verve that I had interpreted as her interest in my lecture. I learned a life lesson that day. Hello, the editor here. That last story was too cool. Like and subscribe for more. Story 8. Back in 8th grade, I had this young super attractive teacher for history. Don't know how old she was, but she had only been teaching for 1 year and was recently married, so my guess is 23-24. Anyway, one day I go to her desk to ask her something, and she was standing and leans forward to show me in the book what I need to read, look at. Well, I missed everything she was saying because holy hell, I could see right down her shirt, and those boobs had 8th grade me captured. I was totally zoned out just looking and looking. At some point she stopped talking and noticed what I was doing and just smiled and was looking at me. Our eyes met and she just smiled, winked, and then sent me on my way. The rest of the year was kind of flirty, but she never ever tried anything. Fast forward 12-13 years, and one day randomly on Facebook I get a friend request from her. Haven't spoke to her since I left the 8th grade. No idea why she added me. Thought, well, maybe she adds all the kids she taught. Well, despite my graduating class having over 1,000 kids, we had no mutual friends. So I waited a while to accept it and then eventually did. Still no friends that were in my grade. Finally, I got creeped out and deleted her. Still have no idea why she did that. Makes me wonder if there's something more behind it. Story 9. It is one of the most flattering things for an attractive student to take an interest in a subject that you are teaching. She's an undergrad and you're tying a subject that you are deeply interested in. Sure, her questions are novice, but she is enthusiastic and curious about your nerdy field in which you basically toil alone. If you make it past the first year without doing anything stupid, the next year you taught the same class, you meet a whole new year of students. And then you realize that there's a whole new crop of attractive young neophytes who bear a striking resemblance to your first crush last year. And that you are probably going to give more or less the same assistance to your students as last year until you realize that in class you are helping everyone refine their understanding. And move on while you toil with few peers in the same subject that many will superficially take an interest in and move on year after year. Story 10. My secondary school English teacher had a crush on me. It wasn't obvious, but I saw it. She was a BBW as classed by my friends. I really did sexualize her and imagine sex with her. I would often stare at her thighs and hips in class. She would often pick me out to answer questions and was more relaxed with me, while a little strict with others, as if we were good friends. She was a good teacher, definitely. Fast forward a few years and I just finished college. I get a Facebook request from my English teacher. I immediately knew why she added me. She was 22 when she worked with us, and that was what I told my brain when I wanted sex with her. We hooked up and had sex. I lived with her for a couple of months and moved out, had sex, etc. That's it really. She just waited until I was old enough, and honestly, she gave better blowjobs than any of the other girls I was with. Story 11. Not a teacher, but I have a story that's really odd. He was our grade 9 homeroom teacher. Let's call him Mr. Nee. Mr. Nee was married, had 2 kids and a darling wife who was a counselor at another school. A lot of people liked him, but he was known to choose favorite and non-favorites. I was a definite non-favorite, so I don't really have any kind words to say about him. But I digress. There was this guy in our class, let's call him Ev. Ev was a typical wannabe gangster kid from the saggy jeans to the DC lid. He was actually a really nice guy, but had an attitude at the same time. Me and him have talked once in a while since finishing high school, and he seems to be doing well with his new girlfriend and job. But again, I digress. Remember how I said Mr. Nee had favorites? Well, let's just say the way he treated his favorites looked like crap compared to how well he treated Ev. Ev practically could do anything in that class while everyone else had limits, even the favorites. Ev could come in late to class, not answer questions, and eat, drink whatever he wanted in class. But the one thing I'll never forget is how Mr. Nee would look at Ev occasionally as the class worked on an assignment or test. I really wish I had a picture, then you would probably understand where I'm going with this. It was pretty obvious to the majority of the class Mr. Nee had a thing for Ev, but as you can probably guess, it never went farther than the awkward glance and smile. Ev was completely oblivious to all of this as he was just happy to have a free class without worry. Who wouldn't be? Mr. Nee still works at my junior high, and sadly, I do run into him a lot on my walks to and from certain places. I'll never know for a fact what Mr. Nee's fixation on Ev was, and it's probably better I don't know. I would just like to know this was just his way of being very nice to a student and nothing else. Story 12. I'm a student, but I have a story I had with my female teacher. I had a teacher who was very attractive. She was 25 years old, blonde, witty, funny, and was also the volleyball coach. She began to drive me to school because she taught there. We lived in the same neighborhood, and I was also one of her favorites, the students the year before, not because of great grades or anything. Actually the opposite. Because I always fucked around in the class and made teaching fun and exciting for her. Her words, by the way. I also babysat her daughter, and her daughter loved me, so I had that going for me as well. Well, every morning before she took me, her husband, who worked as a garbage man, would be out working, and her daughter was usually asleep, so we were alone most of the time. One day, as I watched her daughter and waited for her to get ready, she called from her room and told me to heat up the car and put her daughter inside. As I waited in the car for a while, I was getting pretty bored since her daughter was asleep, and I went in to see if she needed any help. Well, I walked in and saw her walking from the bathroom to her bedroom completely topless, and she locked eyes with me. I jokingly said, "Whoa, praise fucking Jesus," and did the triangle motion prayer thing and pointed towards sky. She laughed as she walked back into her room. After this moment, she always seemed to be more flirtatious. She would talk closer to my face, hold strong eye contact very often, and even started touching my leg. I reciprocated by also being flirty. I eventually switched schools at the end of that year, and we haven't had any contact since. Just recently, I had to get a recommendation letter for my applications, so I thought who better to ask than my favorite teacher, so I went over to her home. Her daughter had grown so much, and I've never seen a child so happy to see me. I sat down beside my teacher in the kitchen and we talked for a long time, catching up on things. She said stuff like, "You've grown so much and I missed you," which seemed mutual because I also missed talking to her. As her daughter watched TV, my teacher did the leg-touching thing again as she whispered about how she was a virgin until college, where she met her husband. She also said that her class is so fucking boring since I left, which I didn't think was completely true. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I was rock hard and she noticed. She said, "Praise Jesus," and we both laughed. Then she grabbed it through my pants. It stopped suddenly when her daughter came up and asked to play with me, so I agreed and I played with her as my teacher wrote the letter of recommendation. After a few hours, I hugged her and her daughter and left the house with an empty feeling. I feel like I could have completed my high school fantasy, but I decided not to that day, mostly because of the fact that She had a husband I respected, and I know I would be really fucking pissed if I had a wife who had sex with another person, mostly with a high school student. However, if shit ever goes wrong with the husband, I will mostly try again. Story 13. My father was my mother's college professor. He was married. They had an affair. They've been married for 45 years. My brother and I are happy and stable, as my parents' relationship is. Reading all these replies, I feel sorry for all the people who kept themselves from getting involved with adult students because of university rules. The typical narrative says power dynamic blah blah, but adults should be allowed to make their own choices and mistakes. Once you hit 18, you're your own person. Sure, sometimes teacher-student relationships don't work. Also, sometimes every other kind of relationship doesn't work. Inserting rules and the threat of firing into two adults doing what they freely choose is fascism. Story 14. That's an interesting sorted after-school special you're creating there. I'm sure lots of people would love to watch it. Perhaps you can write up a synopsis for Reader's Digest too. The adults includes the students. The students are adults too. Adults are responsible for themselves and ought to be allowed to fuck who they want, if they want, when they want. Surely, on some occasions, people fucking each other creates complications. That's the way life works. I'm sure you could think of all kinds of situations where the dynamics aren't perfectly equal and reputations could be hurt, and the rules and laws that should be instituted to protect against such things. Lots of people are scared of sex and sexual dynamics. Wouldn't it be super if we all minded our business and let everyone fuck, or not fuck, who they wanted, based on their own preferences and choices? Yes, it would. Story 15. I work at an expensive school that teaches 4 to 7-year-olds. A few of my students have moms with husbands that work 80-hour weeks and became very interested in me. One in particular sent her daughter to school with skincare products, chocolates, and wine on different occasions. She kept trying to hang out with me outside of school and wanting pictures of me and her daughter together. When she finally got the message that it wasn't happening, she pulled her daughter out of my class and had her quit the school. It was weird.